Okay, welcome everyone to today's webinar put on by the project Voicing Collegiate Recovery. My name is Tanya Nieri. I'm a faculty member in sociology at the University of California, Riverside, and I'm one of the researchers on the Voicing Collegiate Recovery project. So the way today's going to go is we're going to review some logistics, and I'll provide some background on the project, and then we will proceed with today's presentation. So in case you are interested in following up on this event after today or sharing it with anybody who wasn't able to participate, a recording of this webinar as well as other webinars in our series will be available at the website you see listed on the screen right now. So before we proceed, I just want to discuss some logistics. You don't have a lot of controls in the webinar by design. We have all the control as the moderators and presenters. So if you have a question, you can take and you're on a computer, you can take your cursor to the bottom of your screen and this little black window will come up. And you want to click on Q&A and type in your question. Or as you see here, you can email Catherine Rodriguez at this email address. And then our speaker will address those questions at the end of the webinar during the question and answer period. And we have plenty of time for questions and answers. But we're not doing verbal question and answers, or let me rephrase that. We're not doing verbal questions. We're just doing written questions. So you can either email or click on the Q&A button and type it in. Okay. Other logistics, Catherine, you want to proceed? Other logistics, so this is the agenda here. The presentation, we'll have a lengthy question and answer session, and then we'll ask for your feedback via survey. This is the first in a series. And so we'll ask you to fill out this feedback survey so that we can figure out exactly what to do. I want to tell you a little bit. Okay, can you go back one slide, Catherine? So yeah, before I proceed, I realize I probably should have said a couple more things on my earlier slide. So I want to just explain what this project is. It's called Voicing Collegiate Recovery. The principal investigator is Anne Cheney, who is faculty in UCR's medical school. And this is what we call a pre-research project. The goal ultimately is to conduct research to benefit college students in recovery. But in order to do that research and to have that research be meaningful to the community that is, the collegiate recovery community, conversations need to take place among members of that community. And that community includes scholars like Anne and myself and others, students who are in recovery, administrators who run the universities where students are in recovery, and practitioners, whether they be in the university or in the community that work with the recovery community. And so the goal of this project, and the webinar is a portion of that, is to communicate information about what is known currently about college students in recovery and what is not yet known but should be known. And with the goal of then having a community conversation about where should we go forward, what research should we propose to best address the needs as they exist today. So this webinar is a portion of that. The idea is we want to get the community, let us get all on the same page about what is known and not known, what are the main issues, what are the terms that are being used, and so that we all could be using the same language and having the same understanding of the issues as they present themselves. So that's today's webinar. We encourage you to be in touch with us about future events. We have a series of 4 webinars and 4 podcasts. And a couple other events, again, to lay the foundation for community dialogue. It's a 2-year project. So the first year involves much of this sort of community education and conversation. And the second year is more about where do we go from here? How do we propose research to move forward? Okay, thanks, Catherine. I now want to introduce our speaker. We are very happy to have him present for us today. His name is Isaac Smith. He's a psychotherapist with Whole Wellness Therapy. And with that, I will turn the screen over to him and let him take it away. Thank you, Isaac, for being here today and for sharing with us.
All right. Well, I just want to thank Dr. Neary for having me to be a part of this project, and this is a topic that I'm really passionate about, and and so I'm excited to talk to you guys about it today. All right. So just a little bit about me. I am a psychotherapist in private practice. I have a private practice here in Sacramento in the Midtown area, as well as one in the Old Fair Oaks area. And I also work with folks who are California residents online. Before getting into private practice, I was working at UC Davis and helped them build and launch their substance use disorder treatment program that's in effect today, and worked alongside a wonderful addiction psychiatrist named Dr. Martin Lehman. Additionally, with my private practice, I also do some work at a homeless shelter where I run some groups and do some individual work. So I would say that a large majority of the folks that I work with today are dealing with some sort of substance use disorder or addiction. Like I said, I'm really excited to be here and just to get to talk about this topic. All right. So what I'm hoping today is that we'll get to kind of have an open dialogue about drugs, kind of how they affect us, why we tend to gravitate towards them, and why we like them. Understand a little bit more about drug use behavior, also how addiction is commonly viewed, and to know some of the available treatment options that are out there. So why do we like drugs? What's clear is that there are many theories which attempt to explain why people use drugs and alcohol. And furthermore, our friends, coworkers, recovery groups, doctors, everybody's got a different idea about why people use drugs and alcohol. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, these thoughts and ideas reinforce these negative stereotypes, right? Like all addicts are bad people. While some people view this from that sort of moral starting point, others attempt to look at this issue from a philosophical viewpoint. There's a prominent depth psychologist named Dr. Luigi Zoggia, for example, who believes that widespread addiction reflects maybe an unconscious search for what is missing. So all this to say, this fact alone that people have been attempting to understand and conceptualize this topic for many, many years should really give us pause, because it suggests that the reality of understanding addiction or suffering from addiction or a substance use disorder and more attempts at treating those things are not just one-dimensional. So in other words, why somebody uses drugs and what helps them to stop using drugs for that matter really varies greatly from person to person. This is why, for me, I am sort of allergic to these one-size-fits-all approaches, especially as it relates to this topic, because most of the time it can be really unhelpful and sometimes be harmful to the person, as what works for one person is not guaranteed to work for another. Okay? Furthermore, most of us have experienced that the people that are closest to us have the strongest ideas about what we should do in regards to pursuing recovery, which can actually make this whole thing of getting sober even more frustrating and difficult. And frequently, many people feel confused and alone, struggling to know what to do next. So when we study the anthropological data, what's really clear is that for thousands and thousands of years, people have sought out ways to expand their consciousness or to escape those stresses of daily life. In fact, in many cultures, initial drug use is actually considered an integral part of lots of rite of passage ceremonies where perhaps hallucinogenic substances are ingested to evoke these spiritual experience. So in light of this, just studying all that, some have suggested that this desire to escape is actually sort of a fourth drive. Um, for example, there is a psychopharmacologist, an associate research professor named Dr. Siegel, who posits that this desire is simply another drive, similar to our basic drives for water, food, and sex. And similar to other desires, this desire can vary greatly between individuals, um, meaning that some people will have a low desire where others have a strong desire. What this suggests then is that this drive is a natural and universal part of all of us, which takes many different forms for many different people. Um, Take, for example, the differences you might observe in families. So in some families, alcohol and drug use is more accepted and normal, whereas in other families or societies, drug and alcohol use is viewed as wrong or bad. So these family values, along with genetic predispositions, can really impact drug and alcohol use and influence whether or not someone might be more or less likely to develop an addiction. And again, just thinking about that idea of varying desires, some person might have a stronger sex drive than another, and we wouldn't view that as pathological. But for some reason, we do that with folks that are struggling with addiction. Although we're going to talk about this more in the next few slides, it's really important to point out now that all forms of perceived pleasurable activities increase the levels of the neurotransmitter dopamine in the brain. So from eating cake, to having sex, to exercise, or maybe you hit it big in one of those scratchers from the gas station, all of these elicit the dopamine. So first and foremost, we have to remember that there's nothing inherently wrong or bad or pathological about these strong desires. They're all connected with some intrinsic reward. All right, so we're going to talk about the brain and how drugs and alcohol work in the brain. I like to start with this quote because I think it really represents what we know about the brain. So it's unique in having an allegorical representation. It's both mysterious, supernatural, spiritual, and moral. Basically, it's the great unknown, okay? So we know a lot, but we don't know everything, and we're still trying to figure this out. So in our brain, we have specific cells called neurons. And these brain cells communicate with other cells throughout the body by way of something called neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are essentially chemical messengers which carry these messages from one cell to another. And they're really important for the body and how it regulates, okay? Examples of this are, serotonin, which can really influence how happy or sad we are. Dopamine, which is mainly responsible for how we experience pleasure. And endorphins, which can be very powerful pain relievers and often elicit feelings of euphoria. For anybody that's on the call that's a runner, there's lots of people that talk about that runner's high. Well, that's because those endorphins are kicking in particularly after intense exercise. So like neurotransmitters, those chemical messengers, right? Once drugs enter the brain, they participate in this ongoing symphony of regulating emotions. And this really seamlessly happens because the basic chemical structures of drugs are really similar to our own existing chemical messengers or neurotransmitters, what we would call our endogenous neurotransmitters. And what drugs do is they essentially parrot these chemical messengers, right? They hijack and override the system by sending new messages, which either turn up the volume or turn down the volume on these existing neurotransmitter communications. And this is what ultimately leads to that high that we experience. So what does this tell us about the brain on drugs? First of all, it tells us that natural mind and mood altering highways, those chemical highways, are present within everybody. And so drugs simply work through attaching to the receptor sites for these existing chemical messengers. And by doing so, influence both our physical and our emotional states. The main point here is that drugs do not create new pathways, okay? They just take advantage of what's already there. They take advantage of the roads that are already present. And they cannot create sensations and feelings that don't otherwise have a natural counterpart, okay? So we're going to look at this through the lens of opiates, in particular, because there's a crisis that's been going on around opiates, and there's been a lot of national attention about it. And in the coming webinars, we're going to talk a little bit more about other types of drugs. So looking at opiates, when opiates enter our system and make it to the brain, these chemicals attach to special proteins. And these proteins are called mu-opioid receptors, and they're located on the surface of brain cells that are opiate sensitive. So opiate sensitive neurons. Once the opiates are linked, these chemicals trigger the same feelings of pleasure associated with basic life functions like eating and sex. The primary system affected by drugs is called the mesolimbic reward system. And this reward system is located within the midbrain, which is an area of our brains that's responsible for keeping us alive. It's this really primal part of our brain. And the reward system activates to release dopamine, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a neurotransmitter associated with feelings of pleasure. Something that's really interesting to note here is that research tells us that dopamine is released not only in response to a reward, right, but also when we're anticipating that reward is coming, and we're going to get that cake, or we're going to get that drug. If you've ever sat down at a restaurant and that restaurant had pictures of the food that you were about to order, you might experience feeling excited that this food is going to come, okay? Same thing with drugs and alcohol. Sometimes that ritual of getting ready to use can be really more rewarding, especially once addiction sets in, than actually taking the drug itself. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later. When we first take a drug, what happens is that there's a lasting memory that's linked with the feelings, and this memory is recorded in different parts of the brain. Now, this memory will forever be associated with that particular set and setting, that particular place in which we first started using drugs and alcohol. And what we call these things are conditioned associations. Another researcher refers to them as the creation of what's called a neural ghost. So when a person re-enters that environment or social context in which those memories were first formed, more often than not, this really leads to cravings, which can then lead to that drug-seeking behavior, and then what? Ultimately, a relapse. One of the reasons I really like that idea of the neural ghost is, if you think about, when we talk about a ghost, what does a ghost do? Well, a ghost haunts, right? And if you've seen any, B-rated horror movie that features a ghost, it's a ghost that's hangs out in a house where they died a long time ago, and when somebody enters that house, the ghost haunts them and causes all this chaos. It's the same kind of thing when we first take a drug, right? In light of this, it's not surprising that if anybody has been in a recovery circle, they tell you, hey, you probably should avoid the people, places, and things where you used to use drugs and alcohol. So in light of that, those conditioned associations really are important to know. Um, I worked with a client, for instance, who had several years, over a decade of recovery, and he ended up getting some work in an area where he used to do a lot of drugs. And what happened is he was working there, and he ended up going down the street where he used to buy drugs, and he was flooded with intense cravings and urges to use, and actually um, ended up relapsing. And that relapse, happened for about a year, and then I met him. But that really highlighted to me how powerful those conditioned associations, or those neural ghosts, can be. So understanding these cues is really important. This is a quote from Dr. Walter Ling that I think is really interesting. It says, behavior creates experience. Experience creates memory. Memory creates belief systems. Belief systems determine new behavior, and new behavior determines a new outcome. So if you change your memory, you can change your brain. And if you change your brain, you can change your life. So this is really important. When a person is first trying to get off a drug, like opiates, for example, their brain is really trying to figure out how to relearn how to function without that drug. And unfortunately, many people, for lots of different reasons, end up beating themselves up when they're trying to get off. But it's a lot more complex, as we've just talked about, than we can even imagine, because there's just so much happening in the brain. So, what are some factors that affect drug use? And these are actually from a really good book, if you get a chance to taking a look at it, called Perspectives on Addiction by Dr. Margaret Fetting. So, number one, availability. How much access does a person have to that drug or alcohol? With alcohol, it's a little bit easier. With drugs, it can be a little bit more complex. But as I'm always reminding people that I work with, you can change your scenery, but you'll be able to find drugs anywhere if you want to. The capacity for that drug to act quickly. If you're taking a pill, it's going to take a lot longer. If, that route of it, drug use, whether that's IV or snorting, how quickly is that drug going to act? Whether or not we have physical dependence on the drug can really affect drug use. How we grew up, the culture that we're in, what do they say about drugs? Our genetics, are you predisposed to suffering from addiction? And your personality. And the ability for the drug or alcohol to provide symptom relief. This can really impact drug use. If you have been using drugs, for instance, to deal with anxiety, right? And you take a shot every time you feel anxious, that's really going to reinforce that pattern of like, okay, if I feel this feeling, I'm going to take this shot of whiskey because I know that works. So this can influence our drug use. So the primary reason that most of us use drugs and alcohol, right, is that it produces intense, pleasurable feelings. Basically, we like how they make us feel. What the previous slide was talking about, though, is that there are several factors, both individual and environmental, that play a part in whether or not a person that's experimenting with drugs and alcohol will take them long enough to either become dependent or to develop a full-blown addiction. So we're going to talk about the role that tolerance and dependence and then addiction plays in why we continue to keep using. So the brain wants to repeat things that stimulate that reward system. Again, this is because these things help keep us alive. You know, if eating food was not pleasurable, or having sex was not pleasurable, you know, maybe people wouldn't be procreating. They would be neglecting their physical needs for nutrition. So in the early stages of using drugs, the primary reason we continue to use is because that this reward system is being constantly stimulated. However, once a person requires more and more levels of something like opiates, right, to produce a similar effect, we would say that this person has developed a tolerance. So tolerance can be defined simply as the need to take higher and higher dosages of drugs to achieve the same effect. So using, again, the example of opiates, with continued use, the brain cells that are directly affected by opiates become desensitized, and a person will need more and more of that substance to produce the high. Once addiction sets in, many people refer to this kind of cycle as chasing the dragon. Um, uh, Early on in my career, I worked with folks that were struggling with an opiate addiction at a narcotic replacement therapy program that was using methadone. And some of my clients would talk about this like chasing the dragon. They were trying to recreate that first experience of the drug, and they were never successful. So this is what happens when people are, chasing that reward system. Again, think back to that creation of that neural ghost. They're trying to repeat that first experience. So this might be more significant than we even think, as some of the research suggests that this reward system is primarily activated only during a new experience. Okay, so it's primarily activated during the first time that we start using that drugs and alcohol. Okay, so over time, with repeated use of a particular drug, that neurotransmitter dopamine that makes us feel real good fizzles out to the point where some researchers have shown that it no longer produces this neuronal response when we take that drug. In fact, researchers argue that how bad we want that reward, how much we want that drug or alcohol, which is called incentive salience, matters more when it comes to activating the reward system. So in other words, the more we use the drug, the more important it becomes to us, and ultimately helps to, foster the development of an addiction or substance use disorder. So on the other side of that coin, just going back for a minute, we can talk about dependence. And dependence kind of means that our body's dependent on that substance to function. Or even more simply, it's just the susceptibility that we have to experiencing withdrawal symptoms without that substance. Again, kind of drawing from my work with people early on, especially with heroin use, it becomes like this cycle of feeling sick and getting well. Okay. So this is a definition of addiction from the American Society of Addiction Medicine. Addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. Dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. This is reflected in an individual pathologically pursuing reward and/or relief by substance use and other behaviors. Addiction is characterized by an inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioral control, craving, diminished recognition of significant problems with one's behaviors and interpersonal relationships, and a dysfunctional emotional response. Like other chronic diseases, addiction often involves cycles of relapse and remission. And without treatment or engagement in recovery activities, addiction is progressive and can result in disability or premature death. So, all of that wordiness boils down to the reality that when somebody's suffering from addiction, right, it really hangs on to them. It affects them on every level: physical, mental, social, and spiritual. And a person suffering from an addiction will often pursue that addiction to their own detriment. So basically, that substance takes the driver's seat in their life. And if that relationship doesn't change, addiction can have really devastating effects. In the next few slides, we'll talk more about why this happens and revisit a little bit what happens in our brains once addiction sets in. So, why we keep using the addicted brain. All right, so for those of you that like some of this science stuff, you will really enjoy this. For others, I'll try to make this as simple as possible because I think it's important to understand. So in our brains, in this foremost part of our brain, we have something called the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is responsible for impulse control, foresight, planning, judgment, essentially that part of our brain that affects our views on morality. Over time, once addiction sets in, the prefrontal cortex can actually become compromised, and it makes it harder for us to reduce impulses or even change our thoughts about using. So researchers have theorized that this is why some people struggling with addiction start engaging in dangerous and maybe illegal behavior that they might have never thought about doing or completely avoided. You can think about people that maybe turn to stealing or prostitution or lying, right? Because drugs mostly only affect that mid part of our brain, again, that part that's responsible for keeping us alive, to someone experiencing withdrawals from a drug, this can really feel like a matter of life or death. That fight or flight, that sympathetic nervous system response gets activated and subconsciously communicates that, hey, if you don't get that drug or that drink, you're going to die. And with some substances, that's true. But with others, it's not. You just feel that way. So this, sympathetic nervous system response in combination with a prefrontal cortex that's compromised can really make getting clean or abstaining from drugs feel impossible. So again, using the example of opiates, what causes withdrawal symptoms? Once we become dependent, our brain more or less doesn't feel normal or function properly without the substance that we're looking for. And especially with things like opiates, now we're going to need a certain baseline dosage just to feel right in our own skin. Withdrawal symptoms occur as the result of this chemical called noradrenaline, or also called norepinephrine. And this chemical is produced in another part of the brain called the locus coeruleus. I'm just going to call the LC for short because it's a mouthful for me to say. And this is sent to different parts of the body to help with things like being alert, blood pressure, and breathing. When opiates link to receptor sites in the LC, they actually suppress this release of noradrenaline, and this produces that slow responsiveness, drowsiness, and lowered blood pressure that people experience when they're high on opiates. And this is actually one of the primary reasons that people end up dying, because that respiratory system is affected. They overdose, and it stops their breathing. With this continued exposure to opiates, what the LC does, because the brain is really smart, is it upregulates, okay? And it upregulates so that more of that noradrenaline meant to like wake you up, keep you going, is released. So now a person only feels normal when the opiates are present. And unfortunately, the opiates don't have that same effect as they had when maybe we first started experimenting with them. On the other side of that, right, when the opiates aren't present, that increased amount of noradrenaline continues to be released in the body. And this results in anxiety. Some people experience this feeling like their skin is crawling. cramping, diarrhea. This is the body and brain withdrawing from the opiate. So as the result of that opiate tolerance, reducing the normal levels of dopamine in the brain, those activities like eating or sex, while we once found them very rewarding, they actually become inhibited and less rewarding. So I want you to kind of think about this desensitization similar to how somebody might develop hearing loss, okay? Maybe because of overexposure to rock and roll, or in my case, when I was a teenager, punk rock, okay? So continued exposure to loud music leads to hearing loss. And when you have hearing loss, you need to turn up the music louder, right? And turning up the music louder results in more hearing loss, okay? So what we would say is that our hearing has actually become less sensitive. And in order to increase that sensitivity, we need to do the opposite and actually turn down the volume, right? It's the same kind of thing with drug and alcohol use. So what are other reasons why we keep using? We're going to explore the role that addictive beliefs have, what we believe. So when we're struggling with substance use disorders, especially early on, we have these certain ideas about what the drug or alcohol is going to do for us, right? And these are what we conceptualize as addictive beliefs. Again, this is drawing from Margaret Fetting's work in Perspectives on Addiction. So believing that without that substance, we're not going to be able to function. We're not going to be able to maintain this balance. In my work, this belief is particularly huge with people that are trying to get off. That drug has been a really comfort, like a best friend, to go with them to that party or deal with those family members that they have trouble dealing with. So they're fearful of letting that best friend, that comfort go. Maybe an expectation that that the drug that you're taking is going to heighten your social or intellectual functioning. Think about this idea with alcohol of liquid courage, right? Maybe you can only talk to that girl at the bar when you've had a few drinks, okay? Pretty obvious, an expectation that taking the substance will provide pleasure. A belief that taking the substance will result in increased energy or power. For those folks that I've worked with in the past who have been dealing with chronic pain and then developed a dependence and tolerance to opiates, and then maybe started using some opiates for other things outside of that, I've have heard several times that when they first took the opiate, it was the first time they felt energy in so long, right? The chronic pain that they were dealing with was just sucking their energy, and they took the opiate and now they feel energized for the first time. And that can be hard when you are dealing with something like chronic pain, to be able to balance that. There's an expectation that this drug or alcohol is going to be soothing. A belief that the substance will, deal with depression, anxiety, boredom, tension, and this idea that if you don't listen to that urge or craving, this is going to go on forever. When in reality, the data is pretty clear that most of the time, urges to use will at most last about 30 minutes. Essentially, all of these beliefs serve to help keep us in our addictive state. They kind of act as justifications for our behavior or for doing drugs. Who wouldn't want to ingest a substance that will alleviate pain, frustration, and maybe provide some sort of comfort and an illusion of control, right? So in light of this, the first step in treatment often begins by acknowledging or reflecting on the place that drug and alcohol has in our lives, right? Why do I like this drug? What does it do for me? What's the utility of it? So now we're going to talk about some common views on addiction. And There are many, but we're going to talk about the most prominent three, okay? So the disease model, most of us are really familiar with, suggests that substance use disorders or addiction is the result of someone being sick or ill, right? So according to the disease model, addiction is just another medical disorder like diabetes or hypertension. And as a result, it is conceptualized as this chronic, progressive, and incurable disease who many believe that the only treatment is total abstinence. The disease of addiction is considered progressive because it happens in stages, which you can see there. The experimental, social, binge, habituation, problem, dependence, and recovery. The disease model, when it was first came into the scene, helped us really understand the genetic and biological factors that are thought to be really important in understanding substance use disorders as a disease. And it also helped to reduce the stigma associated with drug use. And again, really helped to elucidate or make clear how drugs and alcohol affect our body and brain. Remember, though, a disease of the brain is not a disease of the person, but of the personhood, not the self, but of the selfhood. And basically, it affects our relationships with family, society, and your higher power, if you believe in that. So a disease is not just what's happening within the body. It not just affects the person, but it affects how that person relates to other people. Another prominent way of viewing addiction and treating addiction is called the self-medication hypothesis. And this conceptualizes addiction as a way to mediate psychological stress and suffering, right? It presupposes that we actually turn to drugs in order to cope with our distress, and that our particular drug of choice is often a clue as to what's going on internally. Right? The drug either turns up or animates one's emotion, or conversely, turns down, quiets, dulls, or deadens the internal conflict. The main proponents behind this were these guys named Kantzian and Albanese. And what they do is they argue that people struggling with a substance use disorder sometimes have limited language for their emotions. And because these emotions can be very intense, people end up using drugs passively to suppress these emotions, as they don't really know how or maybe whom to ask for help. So people experiencing psychological suffering, now with the drug on their side, feel that they can face life for the first time, maybe. Other self-medication theorists propose that this addiction provides this illusion of control, meaning that when we're experiencing unpleasant emotions like helplessness or powerlessness, especially over certain stressful life situations, taking drugs feels like this really reliable and maybe only action to combat those feelings. Harm reduction is a way of viewing addiction, because it kind of comes to this understanding of like, look, people are going to use drugs and alcohol anyways, and so we should try to reduce the deleterious effects, the harmful effects of drug and alcohol abuse, not just for the person using the drugs, but also for the person's family and society at large. So harm reduction approaches start with improving the health of the individual, and this simultaneously reduces problematic behaviors like crime or spreading disease, which impact the family system and the community at large. And this model starts with this understanding that there exists within all of us a drive to get high or escape. and that this desire shouldn't be punished, but should be supported and err on the side of understanding. It also assumes that, maybe total abstinence is not a necessary precursor to people pursuing recovery, and sees that any kind of measure of reducing harm is a step in the right direction. There are many types of harm reduction approaches. These include needle exchange programs, which provide clean needles to IV drug users in order to prevent needle sharing and the spread of disease. Programs like Planned Parenthood, which teach safe sex practices and provide condoms to individuals, also offer many other free services like STI testing. Safer methods of drug administration. So, for example, in the Czech Republic, they gave out gelatin capsules for IV methamphetamine users, and found that it was really helpful in reducing some of the harmful effects that come with IV drug use. Interventions that involve limiting drug and alcohol use, or if you're going to go out and have drinks on the weekend, having a designated driver is a form of harm reduction. And then last but not least, replacement therapy programs like methadone or buprenorphine clinics, which allow people that are opiate dependent to actually get stabilized. All right. So what are some first steps if you're interested in getting help, and what are the available treatment options? So when we're first trying to stop using drugs or alcohol, it's often the case that we end up using to alleviate that stress and anxiety that comes with trying to quit, right? In other words, consciously or subconsciously, we fear that we're not going to be able to get on without the substance, or maybe that the treatment that we heard about, or sobriety will just be ineffective. We fear that it's simply just not going to work. And this can be especially true for people who it's not their first time trying to stop using drugs. So what can we do to combat this? My belief is that we need to acknowledge the reality and the urge and impulse to use drugs and not judge that, okay? Not pathologize that we're dealing with an urge. Instead, trying to invite more acceptance that it's going to be there on our journey to sobriety, and will probably ebb and flow in intensity as we move forward. At the same time that we're starting to give ourselves permission to explore, often really competing feelings that arise, we're going to then also build new coping strategies. In other words, we're going to find new ways to deal with stuff in our lives, for which drugs have been a maybe mostly reliable answer, right? At times, our best friend, and most often, our worst enemy. So, in other words, we're going to ask for help. These are the most common treatment options that are available. Medication-assisted therapy, so this would be like methadone or Suboxone, buprenorphine, drugs that help to get people stabilized so that they have less urges. There's a drug called Vivitrol that's helpful. Naltrexone for people using alcohol that are trying to deal with cravings. There's individual or group counseling, which can help you understand not only maybe what's happening in the brain, but explore that relationship, explore the psychological component to drug use. Recovery groups, I'm sure everybody's familiar with AA and NA. There's another recovery group called Refuge Recovery, which has Buddhist undertones, Life Ring, which is a secular type of recovery group, and then Celebrate Recovery, which is a evangelical recovery-based model. And then last but not least, there's detox, residential programs, and sober living. And I would say that these are the four main categories of the treatment options that are available. All right, so let's say that you are ready to get going on your recovery. Um, we're going to talk about some things that might be helpful to think about. Okay, so feeling powerless is not the same thing as being powerless. And I want to kind of help you understand this a little bit more. When you are trying to seek recovery, when you finally say, I need some help, right? When you come to grips with the fact that maybe going it alone is not the wisest decision when it comes to battling drug abuse, this is really an empowered first step. So it's important to remember that a feeling of powerlessness is not synonymous with, realized powerless, right? That fact that you're seeking treatment is a clear example that there's power within you, that you've started to shift the scales of this impulse control back into your favor, and that you're on your path to recovery. To further kind of like make this point, there was some researchers, Hendon, who said that behavior can be voluntary, chosen, and compulsive all at the same time. They argue that our decision-making system is actually capable of being separated into different parts. However, once we've developed tolerance and dependence, meaning that those reward pathways have been essentially hijacked, this decision-making system becomes quieted or subdued, leading to those compulsive behavioral patterns that are really hard to break with willpower alone. So this doesn't suggest that it's literally impossible for people not to use drugs, but highlights the reality that it's much, much harder for someone who is struggling with an addiction. So while it's beneficial to keep in perspective that we often feel powerless over our addiction, it's not beneficial to assume powerlessness, right? Just to give up and say, I can't do this, I might as well not try. Again, when somebody is pursuing treatment, it's a clear example that there's this power within them. I work with a client who was talking to me about this idea the other day, she's been in recovery for a long time. And she was saying that the paradox of powerlessness is that when she asked for help, when she said that, hey, I feel really powerless over this drug, doing that actually gave her power, she felt, right? And so this is the dialectic. That feeling powerlessness is not realized powerlessness, right? Your choice to get help says, hey, there's something within you, right? And asking for a little support is just saying, I need something outside of myself. I don't feel like I can do it alone. So things to remember. Remember that everybody is unique. And if you are trying to get help for a drug and alcohol addiction, you need to find what works for you. There are no one-size-fits-all approaches. You are the expert, and treatment should be this ongoing dialogue between you and your treatment team if you've got one, or you and your sponsor if you go to a 12-step recovery group. And try to be honest with yourself, and especially with the people in your corner, right? The people who have been there with you at your best and your worst. Those are the voices to pay attention to. And I want to make one more point about this idea of one-size-fits-all approaches. The reason I feel so strongly about that is because I've heard so many times people have been told, hey, if you go to this group or you do this treatment and you do it the right way, it's going to work. But what happens is sometimes, even when people are doing all the right things, it doesn't work. And then that ends up making them feel really isolated and alone. They think, oh, I must be the outlier here, that this program is just not going to work for. So that's why it's really important that you figure out whatever combination of things works for you, whether that's, just therapy, or 12-step group and therapy, or just, 12-step group, or medication-assisted therapy with your doctor. You need to figure out the key that unlocks the door for you, not for everybody else. It's good to listen to those things, but it's more important to figure out your own path. So things that I really encourage people to do when they are thinking about getting help is to ask themselves some of these questions. You know, what are your goals? What kind of treatment are you interested in exploring? Where do you want to see yourself in down the road? Trying to think about what's getting in the way. What are those barriers? And what are your strengths? And where do you need more support? So asking yourself these types of questions now really helps you to start setting this intention for your path to recovery, and will also help you adjust your path as needed, or highlight new goals as you progress forward. So future research. These are the main areas that I feel like need a little bit more attention. You know, again, coming from a setting, a primary care setting where I was helping with their outpatient clinic at UC Davis, the things we were always trying to figure out are what were the barriers to people accessing care, right? Especially in those professional settings like with your doctor or at school. What's getting in the way of people feeling comfortable asking for help? Also, right, the role of policy and how that affects people seeking or getting help. Is more of the punitive nature that we have presently getting in the way of us really being able to make an impact and lend a hand to people who are suffering with an addiction. I would also like to see more research be done around mindfulness-based approaches, because I use that a lot in my own practice. I think anyone can really benefit from getting more in touch with their body and their mind, and kind of being able to recognize and create space for whatever comes up. And then lastly, more research about problematic use versus what we understand as classical addiction, right? What's the transition there? People that maybe just use on the weekends and go pretty hard, but don't maybe qualify for that traditional classic addiction. And then just another quote from Dr. Walter Ling. I think he's got a lot of interesting ideas about addiction. He says, "The only way to have your life turn out differently is to act differently." All right. Thank you very much. And I guess now we will answer some questions if there's any.
Yeah, so thank you, Isaac. We appreciate your presentation. So now we want to open the floor for questions, answers, or questions and comments. And again, just to remind you, if you're on a computer, you can scroll down to the bottom and a little panel taskbar will open up, and you can click on Q&A and type in your question, and Isaac will be able to verbally respond to you. And feel free to put in comments as well.
I am not in that question thing. I'm sorry.
Okay, so we have a question from Catherine. She says, is there anything in particular we should think about when treating college students?
I think that, again, part of the reason I wanted to do this presentation is just to kind of take out the stigma of this drive that we all have to escape, whether that is through drugs and alcohol or through other things like work or what have you. So I think normalizing that more, my belief, would open up more conversation and would lead to people using the support systems that are available. I think that people that have a stronger drive still get a real bad rap, and they're afraid to talk to people about it because everybody's got different ideas about what it means to use drugs, or somebody that does suffer from addiction. And in my experience, addiction does not discriminate at all. It affects people from all walks of life and socioeconomic status, and you have it.
So we have another question. How can we best create a community in which students feel comfortable coming forward and sharing their recovery stories?
I think you have to make space for it, very publicly open space to talk about it. More conversations more often, not just once a year, but ongoing, where uh, pe- people that are the leaders in the school settings are having these conversations and talking about it in a way that invites dialogue and doesn't just view it as something like inherently wrong or pathological.
Other questions or comments from the group?
I think also maybe creating a way for students to offer up their own ideas about how to increase the dialogue, and maybe doing it anonymously would be really helpful. To ask students, hey, what do you feel like you need? What would make you feel more comfortable opening up and talking about this topic?
So a question here is, are there any fundamental physiological differences in addiction to stimulants versus downers?
I'm not sure what that person is, what Chris is asking there, meaning like, how does it differ in the body? Um, I mean, there are definitely different chemical highways that are accessed when somebody takes a downer as opposed to a stimulant, for sure, and different chemicals that are released. Maybe that person is asking if it's harder to get off one as opposed to another, um, and I think that varies from person to person, because something that we didn't talk a whole lot about is just that psychological dependence that people often feel about their drug of choice or alcohol, right? Which is why I believe it's really important to explore the role that someone's substance has in their life.
We have a question. Do you have any ideas about how to encourage students to open up and talk to other students in recovery?
Um, Again, I think just creating a way for people to do that, to talk about it, open up about it.
Like what? What would be a way that you might think of?
Well, doing sort of like a poll of students about like, hey, what would be a comfortable space for you guys to talk about drugs and alcohol openly, and without fearing like you're going to be judged or that you're going to be viewed differently. I think a lot of the times we have things that look good on paper without really talking to the people that are affected by a particular thing about what would work for them. So creating more ways to offer feedback and submit their own ideas about, how could you increase dialogue between your peers. More forums, more regular forums. Again, not just like the once a year type things, but having things that are regularly going on that people can, spaces where people can come and dialogue.
So this is Tanya. I just wanted to share a comment related to this line of conversation about how to get people to share their experience. I mean, I think we could do, well, one way to do it is by starting conversations about pleasure more abstractly, right?
Mhm.
Because pleasure, if you frame it in terms of, oh, let's have a dialogue about what brings you pleasure, um, that doesn't immediately prompt the, oh, you're immoral, you're sick, whatever, whereas if you say, let's talk about how drugs bring you pleasure, but that might open the dialogue. But because I feel like there's a lot of things that bring us pleasure that we don't talk about, that we could talk more about. I mean, one of the other obvious ones is sex. And I don't know why. I mean, we don't talk about it. Why can't we have college students talking more about how to have sex and how to have pleasure during sex? I'll never forget when I was in college, there was actually a rap session about masturbation. And it was like huge that for me, this concept that people were having an open dialogue about masturbation, that people do it, how to do it. Um, yeah, I mean, so having conversations about, I think another example is we actually have quite a bit of conversation about alcohol and to some extent the way, because it's legal, right? At least for a subset of people, it's legal. And so people do have open conversations about drinking games or, recipes for cocktails and things like that. Now, obviously, students may have those conversations in some contexts and not in others. They might talk about it openly with their friends, but not with their parents at home or whatever. But I don't know, so that perhaps we could think more about what enables those the few conversations that are occurring, what is enabling those to occur? And then can we replicate those conditions to have conversations about illicit drug use or other types of pleasurable behavior?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think another thing that kind of gets in the way here is that, and most of the time when people talk about alcohol and drug use, they talk about it, they say, oh, this is kind of an open thing that we can talk about it, but a lot of the times it's about, okay, you're either going to use or not use, right? It's either total abstinence or you're going to be using it all the time. And I feel like for a lot of people, they might still be exploring that role that drugs or alcohol have in their life. And that could be a roadblock to even them having the conversation about it, because they think, okay, yeah, I'm going to come to this thing. They say it's an open dialogue, but at the end, it's just going to be preaching like a total abstinence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of people that fall in the middle there that maybe use problematically sometimes and need a little support around, like, hey, let's explore that behavior. And is that a behavior that's, useful and helpful to you? And if so, in what way? And in the other side of the coin, where does it really take a hold of your life and get in the way of where you want to be and where you want to go? There's not a lot of dialogue about people that maybe are trying to use those substances responsibly. It's often always just talked about, either or, black and white terms.
So we have a question. Have you come across any research that connects genes or heredity to addiction and addictive personalities or habits?
Yeah, I think that we know from the data that there are some people are predisposed to addiction. As far as the addictive personality, I'm not sure that I believe in addictive personalities. I think that we tend to demonize the drug or the alcohol without exploring that role again. And so when people haven't understood that this thing is doing something for them in their life, they might gravitate towards something else. And I think that that's where people get this idea of addictive personalities. I will say that one of the coolest things that we've come to know about genetic predisposition is actually something called epigenetics. And epigenetics is really exciting because it basically, we used to think that, okay, if you have, this gene, you are bound to get this type of cancer, or you're bound to suffer from an addiction, because if you have A, it's going to lead to B. But epigenetics really helped us understand that your environment, your lifestyle, what you put into your body, all of these things matter when it comes to whether or not that gene is expressed, right? So if you have a predisposition, whether or not that light switch turns on and you do develop that cancer, or you do develop a full-blown addiction, that what you do is so important, and it's actually important for your future progeny if you're going to have kids. And I think that that's a really hopeful and exciting thing that we've come to learn about, is that we're not just born to suffer with X all the time, that we have more say and more control over what happens.
Other questions or comments from the group? What would you tell someone who was convinced that they can never stop using a particular drug?
So as a therapist, I wouldn't try to get involved in the like the verbal boxing that could lead to, right? Trying to argue with them about that. I would try to explore, again, why it is that they feel like they could never stop using a drug, why it is so important to them. And I think that that dialogue about that and having someone understand and think about them really can open up their mind about, whoa, like understanding myself a little bit more, and why I feel like I need this and why it's so important to me. I would just kind of roll with that resistance without getting into an argument about it. I would just try to explore it. That's a great question. Any other thoughts or questions from people?
So here's a question. How can we apply what we learned today to understanding students in recovery?
Well, hopefully what people took away from today is understanding a little bit more about like the brain and how complex that, how complex dealing with or struggling with an addiction is, and that there are not, some one size fits all approaches, and that people use drugs and alcohol for lots of different reasons. So hopefully that will open up more dialogue around that, to being able to talk about this topic openly without pathologizing that drive.
This is Tanya. I wonder if we could add to the list of future research the question of how to cultivate and maintain an ongoing dialogue about pleasure and the role that drugs can play, right?
Mm-hmm.
Drive that people have.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps that's something that we need to study more, is how do you get students to be able to talk about, in a safe space, in a non-punitive space, what they experience when they use drugs and what motivates them. For example, I was thinking about like just this whole idea about, for people in recovery, it's about shifting, right? Finding pleasure in a different way. And there, a colleague here in the university, she studies people who go to like yoga festivals and places like Burning Man. And what she talked about is that they feel, those events fill a need for them. So they are escaping from their normal lives, quote unquote. And there's something that those festivals provide that they don't get in their regular lives. And again, it seems to me that perhaps we need to explore through research, being able to have conversations about, you know, it not just drugs, but certainly with the starting point being college students in recovery and or college students who use drugs, you know, what do drugs do for them, and why are they able to get that in any other place, or, you know, and if not, why not?
Hmm. I think a lot of times we villainize the drug or the alcohol, right? Like that's where our focus is. You know, you can see that with the opioid crisis, and you know, don't get me wrong. I think there are lots of reasons why we're dealing with what we're dealing with, and that there's responsibility that some of these big companies need to take for their role in helping to foster that. But I think that that's just not the appropriate focus, is just on the substance alone, but actually exploring why a person gravitates that, and why, you know, one person who takes that doesn't become addicted where somebody else does. And I think it has a lot to do with that idea that you were talking about escaping.
Thank you. So we have a question. In your experience, have you witnessed anybody leaving their addiction as a result of an intense religious or psychedelic experience? Meaning, I think the question is ending, you know, coming out of addiction as a result of a religious or psychedelic experience?
There are some pretty interesting things around. They're doing a lot of research around certain psychedelics that some people have found beneficial. You know, I think that one of the reasons why AA can be, or NA can be so effective, is because not only are you getting this community experience sometimes, but you're also getting kind of like a rebirth or religious experience in and of itself, you know, where you're becoming a new version of yourself there. And there's lots of ritual in that. And I think that, I forget where I was reading this, but, you know, I don't think that we have explored enough the role that ritual plays in helping people to create new behavior. So yeah, I mean, again, I don't think there's one size fits all approaches. So you know, there have been people I have seen that have really benefited from something like that. And there's other people where AA has been more of a deterrent and not the ticket for them. So I think that's why it's important that folks focus on what, you know, exploring that path and what works for them, listening to ideas about things that might help, but ultimately trusting their gut and getting more in touch with their gut about what to do.
We have time for more questions or comments. Okay, unless anybody has any additional talks, I will say thank you, or sorry, additional questions or comments. I will say thanks again to our presenter, Isaac Smith, and thanks to all of those of you who attended. And we're gonna show up on the screen here. Catherine, can we bring the survey link? So we invite you to complete the survey so that you can give us feedback. Tell us what worked, what might be, what might work better. And just any general feedback that you have. So we would really appreciate that. So thank you again, Isaac. Thank you again, presenter or attendees. And thank you, Catherine, who was our tech support and overall glue holding us all together. Thank you.
Thanks so much.